I've been waiting a long time to do this one. A few months ago, the Switch hacking community released a tool called SysClock, allowing users of exploited Nintendo hardware to monitor and adjust the clock speeds of the Switch hardware. Now, you may remember that I used SysClock extensively to get to the bottom of Nintendo's so-called boost mode, the process where Switch loading times are decreased by momentarily overclocking the CPU. I also used SysClock to confirm that in handheld mode, Nintendo had increased max GPU clocks from 384 MHz to 460 in select cases on select games. But what I didn't do was to actually use SysClock myself to overclock Switch hardware and test games performance. Truth is, I was kind of hoping that Nintendo would do it themselves with the T2110B chip found in the Switch Mini and the new Switch refresh, but my understanding is that developers have been told to expect no new performance profiles for the new kit, even though the new processor is capable of faster GPU clocks. Truth is, the newer, smaller, cooler Tegra X1 is used for increased battery life only. Now that's a win, but I really wanted to see what would happen when the latent power inside the Switch was actually fully utilized. Now before I go on, let's make one thing clear. Overclocking Switch requires doing ungodly things to the hardware that at the very least could invalidate your warranty. It's pretty likely to be banned at some point from online services, and you may even brick your hardware, so you have been warned. With that out of the way, look, there's a ton of data to get through here. I mean, basically you could bench the entire Switch library and likely find a huge amount of fascinating results. And that's why I loved doing this project. At the most basic level, we have the ability to experiment with a current gen system in its prime in a way that I don't think we've ever seen before, which means, well, essentially anything goes. I could be here all year, seriously. But unfortunately, I haven't got all year. So what I'm going to do is to divide up the data, to divide up the testing. In this video, I'll be examining docked mode only, overclocking both CPU and GPU to see what kind of improved game performance I can get. And in the process, I hope to gain a better understanding of the challenges in developing for Switch. After all, we're dealing with a handheld here that can run in Tech 6, that has a Witcher 3 port en route and produces incredible games like Zelda Breath of the Wild. To get these kind of results from a Tegra requires serious skills, but clearly performance can be an issue. The silicon is being pushed hard, really hard. So where are the bottlenecks? What are the challenges? I wanted to find out. Not only that, but I wanted to see what would happen to Switch efficiency and heat generation when you do indeed overclock the processor. But to be clear here, we're not actually overclocking the chip as such, we're actually running it at frequencies that are specified for the Shield Android TV. So essentially getting the full potential of the chip at its stock configuration outside of the Switch ecosystem. So here's a table showing the capabilities of the Switch as we know it so far. For various reasons, Nintendo has been holding back on us. Tegra X1 was designed to run its CPU at a maximum clock of 1785 MHz with GPU at 921 MHz. Instead, Nintendo chose to be conservative. Question is this holding games back, and how? Okay, so where better to start than what is likely to be the worst performing game on Switch? Dragon Quest Builders 2 running user-made content levels. I just dipped into the available levels online and chose one with a huge hashtag, and the goods were immediately delivered. While the story mode tends to run at 25 FPS and upwards with an unlocked frame rate, those hashtag huge levels can see performance drop as low as 7 frames per second, something that Tom did in his video and that I was able to replicate pretty easily on other user-made content. In his video, Tom's contention was that the game was CPU bound, since docked and handheld play pretty much on equal terms. And of course, docked and handheld CPU clocks are the same. Anyway, I could actually dial this up from 1020 MHz to 1785, and here's what happens. I get a maximum increase of 4 frames per second. Which isn't much, you might think, but it is a 40% increase in frame rate at times. But this is still obviously astonishingly poor. Funny thing here is that the game actually has slowdown, actual slowdown, to the point where the same route through the level takes 20% longer to complete with the game at the stock CPU speeds. So we have a bit of success there, right? So how about adding a GPU overclock on top of that? I can push to 921 MHz, a 20% uptick in concert with the existing CPU boost. And it makes no real difference whatsoever. Frame rate is the same throughout, and you'll note that the two overclocked runs are basically in sync, again confirming parity in performance in that they both slow down to the same degree. So essentially then, our first overclocking test confirms that the Switch is limited by its CPU in this particular stress test. So where do we go next? Mention Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and you'll hear talk of poor performance in the likes of Kakariko Village, and most notably the Korok Forest. Well, Nintendo has patched the game over time, of course, with patch notes telling us to expect a more, and I quote, pleasant experience. And you know what? It's true. Take a stroll through Kakariko Village these days and essentially you hit the frame rate target, just the odd dropped frame. Total non-issue really, and no need to overclock because this is it, it's fine. Yes, there's the odd stutter, but who really cares? Korok does have some issues, as you can see right here. Approach the initial clearing and this will drop you down to 20 frames per second, and on some runs it can actually dip a touch beneath that. Interestingly, maxing out CPU does increase the readout just a touch, though to be fair we don't have a like-for-like comparison here due to dynamic lighting variations and slight differences in gameplay. But it is, you know, a small victory I guess. But you kind of expect more from a 75% uptick in CPU frequency. Maxing out GPU? That's a bit more like it, but performance can still drop. So maybe the improvement in frame rate here is in line with a 20% boost to GPU clocks, but there is the possibility that we're limited by memory bandwidth, something we should be able to prove further down the line once we take a look at handheld mode. But docked memory bandwidth is already maxed. Limiting factors in Switch titles can come from strange places. You might have watched John's vid on the Doom trilogy and wondered why using the flashlight setting at max caused performance issues in Doom 3. Well, I decided to look into it and I have answers, and curious ones at that. Right, so check this out. With the exception of one stutter, overclocking the CPU alone fixes the issue. No real point overclocking the GPU, I guess, after that, but I did it anyway. The one-off stutter I had has gone, but I had trouble repeating it again with or without the GPU overclock, so it may have just been a freak drop in the first place. Bottom line though, the calculations required for the shadows are the issue here, presumably not the physical rendering of the shadows themselves. Interesting stuff, right? Well, funny enough, the CPU overclock here effectively puts the Switch version on par with PS4 and Xbox One, and indeed PC at 1080p. Panic button's work here totally wipes the floor with the last gen versions of the game, that's for sure. Okay, look, I know there's probably some other id Tech games you'd like me to check out too, but rest assured I will get around to that, but not just now. Indulge me here because this one is fascinating too. Mortal Kombat 11 is an interesting game because the developer was the first third party to be allowed to use the 460 MHz GPU preset in handheld mode, but the game still struggles docked on this particular stage at least, with dips beneath the target 60 frames per second. Now, using the replay system here, we can actually get a complete match on the action from start to finish. But one thing to point out is that once again, frame drops result in actual slowdown, meaning head-to-head comparisons will drop out of sync. Again though, we have some curious results that I'm looking forward to sharing with you here. First of all, I maxed the GPU only, thinking that this was the bottleneck, and while there are variations against stock, you'll note that by and large, the ebb and flow of performance across the replay does not change. The further we go into the clip, the more slowdown starts to slowly desync the two runs. However, if you were to play the two side by side, I really doubt you'd be able to tell any difference at all, despite a 20% increase in GPU clocks. Okay, so the next head-to-head run compares a maxed CPU with stock GPU up against a full overclock on both components. What you will note straight away is that both of these readings are giving better results than the last comparison. Our CPU only overclock takes us most of the way to locking to 60 frames per second, and because of that, the remaining bottlenecks shift. They're now GPU in nature, and now the extra graphics power that didn't do anything before can actually make a difference. There are still some dips beneath 60, but I'd say that this is a big improvement over stock performance. I'd venture to suggest that MK11 on this stage at least has some CPU limitations, and once overcome, graphics becomes the limiting factor. So yeah, that's why our all overclock benchmark does actually show improvement. And just now we can talk about Panic Button's brilliant id Tech 6 Switch games, and we're going to focus on the latest one, Wolfenstein Youngblood. I'm sure you watched John's Switch coverage on this. It seems to be another improvement over prior work, but just about any firefight can produce performance problems. Sometimes they're slight, like this, possibly unnoticeable for the most part, and sometimes they're a lot more obtrusive, like this. Frame rate can drop to the mid-20s, which isn't great. 1785 MHz CPU overclocked first, and you've probably guessed the script. While the game is still somewhat blurry, the performance is essentially locked to 30 frames per second. On this less taxing area, the bad frame pacing we've criticized these ports for in the past is less of an issue. Once we move on to the more challenging area, we do start to lose a clutch of frames with the CPU overclock. But the mid-20s performance level is gone because basically, well, you know, we're getting much smoother performance from higher CPU clocks. And you know what happens next? Once we overclock the GPU after that, performance is smoother still, dips in the more intense firefight are gone, and similar to Mortal Kombat 11, the GPU OC can now be put to work. As well as slightly smoother performance, the extra GPU cycles tie into the dynamic resolution scaling system, giving us a clearer image. I'm not going to say that the game is radically improved visually, but overall, overclocked is the way I'd prefer to play this game. So after that, I went back, all the way back, to Panic Button's Doom 2016 conversion, and with the max overclock in place, you get a similar result. It's not a locked 30 all of the time, but the frame pacing issues are subsiding somewhat, and generally performance is much higher than playing the game out of the box. So what is the price of this performance increase? Well, I synchronized capture with photography of my watt meter, running Wolfenstein at stock clocks and with full CPU, GPU overclocks in place. And here's how the comparison looks. Now, the problem with frame rate limiters is that GPU isn't always going to be running flat out. In this case, it's going to max at 30 frames per second, and neither is the CPU really, even if the performance level will be boosted by the increased CPU clocks. In general gameplay across the run of play, the biggest delta between stock and OC seems to be in the region of 4.5 watts. That may not sound like much, but when stock clocks are mostly in the 15 watt territory, that is a big uptick. Also note that I've maxed the battery here at 100%, so none of the power draw here is going to be used to charge the battery. This is all game performance. Using my compromise switch, I was also able to measure the temperature of the processor using its internal sensors. Before we look at the data, it is worth stating categorically that the switch fans spin up considerably more when overclocking, so any increase in temperature we're going to record here is happening despite the more active cooling, the louder fan. Okay, stock measurements first. After a good deal of gameplay with the switch running at full pelt, maximum temperature 60 degrees Celsius. Across the same run of play for a very similar duration with CPU at its maximum 1785 MHz, temperatures reached a peak of 64 degrees Celsius. Maximum temperature with both CPU and GPU at max overclock, 67 degrees. Now for reference, the processor will throttle back at around 83 degrees, so yeah, we do have a fair degree of latitude there. I'd like to see more granular power draw figures here and to compare them to the new Switch. I'm also hoping that when I get the time to check out handheld overclocks, we can get a better view on power consumption there. I mean, I've always been blown away by how much Switch is delivering from the tiniest of power draw. I think the takeaway here and now is that, well, Nintendo is quite conservative with its clocks. But it has to be really. A lot of overhead needs to be built in for more severe conditions after all. But cast your mind back to the boost mode video I did. Nintendo is pushing higher clocks already. A system that was initially limited to 307.2 MHz GPU in mobile mode is now being allowed to run at 460 MHz, nigh on 50% increase in frequency. I'm going to close out with what you might call an overclocking disaster area, but one that opens a new vector for testing and also illustrates that even with access to spades more GPU and CPU performance, other bottlenecks can exist that developers have to address. Yes, I'm going there. It's Saints Row the Third. This is all new frame rate data since the game has been patched, and I've got to say that compared to the initial launch, it does run faster. It's still running with an unlocked frame rate though, which does present problems. One moment you can be threatening the 40 FPS grid limit on this graph, the next you're languishing at 20 frames per second or under. Look, I'm going to cut straight to the chase here with a three-way comparison of stock, CPU OC and CPU GPU overclock, and the action is pretty dynamic here, so look for trends rather than direct in-the-moment head-to-head comparison. End result, going up the ladder here, the average comes in at around a 1 FPS improvement as we overclock from one test to the next. And you'll see very little variation in performance at all. Bottleneck is profound, but what is it? Again, memory bandwidth is the likely culprit, something that in docked mode at least you can't do anything about because we're already running at the maximum 1600 MHz. But what if? Well, what if we could switch to Saints Row's mobile configuration while docked and then apply the overclock? Well, that's exactly what I can do by combining the use of sysclock with another tool, Reverse NX, which allows you to choose mobile mode when docked, and interestingly the reverse too. Essentially in this case we're looking at identical clocks running at 720p and 1080p, the resolution profiles for docked and mobile mode in Saints Row. By reducing resolution we free up bandwidth and we get a performance difference that is quite profound. In this clip it's pretty significant at around 20 frames per second. Now this can vary up and down. But you know what, you've got to wonder what an intermediate resolution like maybe 900p could do with a 30 FPS cap. And by extension you've kind of got to wonder what other games that are bottlenecked could run much faster if you engage the handheld mode with the full overclock. So lots of testing here, and I've got some takeaways before I finish up. First of all, I do wonder whether Nintendo is planning an evolving platform here. We've already seen that it's pushing clocks up in select scenarios, and maybe it's just going to continue doing that over time. They can be newer, higher performance profiles for certain games that will still run on a launch Switch like mine, but will result in more noise or shorter battery life when gaming on the go. Less of a problem, of course, for those units running the new processor. I was also surprised to see how often the CPU is the limiting factor. I mean, those Doom tests in particular are quite fascinating. Switch has a quad-core ARM Cortex-A57 cluster, but only 3 cores are available to developers, and they only run at 1020 MHz. Now, even now, developer units can run at 1220 MHz, while obviously compromised units like mine scale all the way up to 1785. Gut feeling, just increasing clocks to 1220 MHz could improve game performance significantly based on the CPU-bound scenarios I've seen so far. And maybe that's something Nintendo will consider in the fullness of time. Clearly the performance profiles that the Switch has are somewhat fluid based on the way the platform seems to be getting progressively more powerful. But yeah, handheld mode, that's what I'm going to be looking at next. And I'm going to find this particularly interesting because Switch is already such a fantastic handheld. And I'm going to be interested to see what happens, for example, running the docked configuration of games in mobile mode. What would that do to power draw and battery life? And by extension, we can figure out how much of an impact to battery life it would have on the new version of the Nintendo Switch. And I'm also interested in seeing exactly how much power the existing Switch SoC draws in mobile mode. So lots of questions remain then, but that's where I'm leaving things for now. As always, please do like and subscribe to support our work and ring the bell for instant notifications whenever a new Digital Foundry video drops. And yes, DF Patreon supporters, I love you and our team loves you too. By supporting us directly, you're making detailed analysis work like this possible on our own terms. So if you'd like to join our crew, please do. And remember that we have a library of almost 3 years worth of pristine quality downloads that you can access at will if you're a Patreon supporter. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this one, if indeed you did. And from me for now, thanks for watching.